Well,
Yeah.
I'll just start off. I just want to start off by thanking our partners for this project. This workshop series was funded through support received through Western Economic Diversification Canada. So we're very grateful for that funding. I want to acknowledge the Saskatchewan Craft Council and all the work Carmen and her team have done to pull this workshop series together. And then of course, Bernard and his team at the Atlantic Craft Alliance, who this is their content and we're really excited to learn from you guys. And for Creative Saskatchewan as the funding agency to see if there's better opportunities we could be taking to support craft in Saskatchewan. So thank you everyone and welcome, and I'm excited to learn along with you today.
Thanks, Erin. I'm Carmen Milankovic. I'm the Executive Director of the Saskatchewan Craft Council. And I just want to begin by indicating that the Saskatchewan Craft Council acknowledges that the land on which we gather is Treaty 6 territory, the traditional territory of numerous First Nations, including Plains and Woods Cree, Dene, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Anishinaabe, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. As we are all treaty people, acknowledging traditional territory and this relationship is one of the many steps we can take to recognize the land's history, to pay respects to the Indigenous people whose practices and spiritualities continue to develop, grow, and contribute to this land. I want to welcome all of you to the Saskatchewan Craft Council's Professional Practices Program, designed to equip you for success in the wholesale and export markets. We are fortunate this weekend to tap into the knowledge and resources of Bernard Burton and Greg Toole from Craft Alliance Atlantic. Throughout my time with the SCC, I have marveled at the depth and breadth of knowledge that Bernie and Greg bring to this discussion and to the innovation that is part of their program delivery. Craft Alliance Atlantic is a pan-Atlantic trade association, and they're based in Halifax. And they work to provide market development opportunities to the craft sector in the areas of wholesale markets and exporting. For over 43 years, the 4 Atlantic provinces have cooperated in joint projects to further the craft sector in the region. That's amazing and worth celebrating, I think. How have you managed to get along for all that time? When Erin Dean, who you met already, and she's the CEO of Creative Saskatchewan, came to me and asked how she could help the craft sector gain more market knowledge, I proposed a series of workshops and consultations to enhance our understanding of the wholesale and export markets and how they affect craft. She jumped on the idea, and with Western Economic Diversification through the Government of Canada, she agreed to fund this program so that we could explore the opportunities and issues surrounding this discussion. So thank you, Creative Saskatchewan, for your leadership and your constant support of our programs. This session has 58 registrants. I see 45 of them who have arrived. I'm so pleased with that number. I'd like to welcome craftspeople from BC, Alberta, and Manitoba who have joined us. We decided to create some spaces for you so that we could further maximize the reach of this discussion. Please note that if you are a member of the Saskatchewan Craft Council, and if you've attended at least 2 of these sessions, you are eligible for a one-on-one consultation with Bernie and Greg. You need to register, and if you are selected, we'll let you know. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation, so please send them in the chat function. Is that where you want them, or you want them in the Q&A?
And the Q&A allows us to keep track of them a little easier. So that
okay, Q&A, please, yeah. Not in the chat.
Yeah.
And now let me introduce our resource people. Bernard is the Executive Director of the Alliance and has been in this role since May of 2000. Bernie has worked in the Canadian craft community for the past 35 years and had many roles from retailer, maker, and administrator to volunteer and collector. He is past president of Craft Nova Scotia and is currently vice president of the Canadian Crafts Federation and the World Craft Council North America. Greg is the manager, export programs at the Alliance, and has been in this role for 4.5 years. Greg joined Craft Alliance after having worked as program officer with Arts NB Greg is currently working to complete his certification in international trade. Greg has worked in business and cultural development and is a musician with a keen interest in craft and the arts. So welcome, Bernie and Greg, and welcome to everyone who's on this Zoom call, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Erin, and thank you, Carmen. It's a great privilege to present these workshops over the next couple of days, and we're actually really excited to give us an opportunity to refresh our presentations as well, and to look at new things that are happening, given what's happened in 2020 and what's ahead of us in 2021. So we're just going to start with Greg. We actually have our own land acknowledgement as well.
Yeah, thanks, Bernie. So yeah, we just wanted to offer an extension of the acknowledgement that Carmen made of the land that we occupy, Craft Alliance Atlantic Association. We're a Pan-Atlantic Trade Association based in Mi'kma'ki, so Nova Scotia, and specifically Halifax, Chibuktuk. And we have a mandate to support the growth of craftspeople working on the ancestral and unceded territories of Indigenous people across Atlantic Canada, primarily. And in knowing that we are going to be working with Saskatchewan, we recognize also that people are going to be joining us from many treaty territories, Treaty 2, Treaty 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10 across Saskatchewan, traditional territories of Assiniboine, Cree, Dene, Dakota, Saulteaux, and homeland of the Métis Nation, among others. We wanted to acknowledge the historical oppression of lands, cultures, and original peoples in what we now know as Canada. We respect and affirm the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples, and encourage all our clients and partners to explore the fundamental impact of First Nations craftsmanship on the current craft traditions enjoyed across Turtle Island today. Again, each of us in our work and personal lives, we all hold a responsibility to consider that relationship we have to colonialism and the persisting impacts on First Nation communities it has. And we know that by reflecting and educating ourselves further, everyone can develop their own path for approaching reconciliation and decolonization. And just to remember that we're all treaty people, and all of our efforts have an impact. So thanks, Carmen, thanks, Erin, and I'll pass it back to you, Bernie.
Great, thank you, Greg. So this workshop series that we're doing today, we're going to be talking about wholesale market development. This afternoon, later on, we're going to be talking about exporting. Tomorrow, we're doing a trend session. And on Monday, we're actually doing a special session with Sask Galleries Association, talking about exporting for commercial galleries. So in preparing for this session right now, looking at everyone who had registered and the pre-registration questions that we included in the registration process, we've seen that a good majority of the participants who signed up today have not wholesaled their craft in the past. We have a few people who are very experienced. So we hope that that'll be a good refresher and review for them, and that the information that we provide going forward will be valuable to those who haven't been involved in wholesale market development before or previously. And Carmen mentioned 43 years. Yes, it's an amazing task. And you know, back in the 1970s, which is quite a long time ago now, there were a concentrated group of government representatives in Atlantic Canada who all had very diverse craft backgrounds that were working in government, and that's how everything got started. And then back in 2009, we actually became our own independent trade association. Prior to that, we were actually just a project of government. So we've come a long way in the last 12 years as Craft Alliance Atlantic. So the workshops we've developed, the Ready, Set, Go workshop is actually a full day, 5 to 6 hour workshop that we present on wholesale market development. It includes many aspects and goes into many details of what wholesale market is and how to enter it as a craftsperson. So what we're going to look at today is specifically what is wholesale, how to get into wholesale. The Saskatchewan Craft Council felt that we should really spend a lot of time in this presentation discussing pricing and pricing strategies that are relevant to wholesale markets. So that's what we're going to do. You can put any questions or for Greg in the Q&A, and we will try to get to those later in the presentation. There may be lots of things we don't cover today. So at the end of the presentation, we've actually put some additional extra slides of other considerations and extra content that may be relevant for people that are really interested in moving into wholesale in the near future. So that kind of leaves the door open, Carmen, especially if we want to do follow-up workshops at some point throughout 2021 and further expand on some of the areas of discussion. So where I like to start with a discussion about wholesale and wholesale market development is a definition of wholesale. So this is your standard dictionary definition. So wholesale is the sale of commodities in quantity for the purpose of resale. It also means the selling or related to the selling of goods in large quantities for resale to the consumer, or the selling of goods to merchants, usually in large quantities for resale to consumers. So this is a really interesting element, and this is one of the most frequently misunderstood elements of getting into the wholesale market, is that comment in the definition about what is a large quantity. And I think it's really paramount that people understand that as the maker and the producer of the product or the goods that you're making, you control supply and demand of that product. So when you're starting out in wholesale, the great thing about the craft sector is that you have the ability to scale your business. And whether you scale that to something that's manageable on your own, or whether you scale that big and start hiring employees to help you with that process, is really up to you. So quantity, in most cases in the craft and giftware industry, is totally determined by you, the maker. And you can decide how big you want to go with that. So you can start off small. You can start working with 2 or 3 retailers, expanding that maybe to 5 or 10. And then maybe, you make the decision at some point in time that, okay, that's enough for me. That's as far as I want to go with my wholesale. Or if you have, the personal goal of expanding your studio practice and hiring employees and developing a much broader range of product, then you can do that too. And I think that's the great thing. Craftspeople have that flexibility to either produce a little or produce a lot. And then how you go about doing that is part of the process that we're going to explore and discuss further today. So just to start out, I like to point out the differences between retail and wholesale. And so most craftspeople starting out in a studio practice, you start making product, you start selling it. Most craftspeople start out maybe at a farmer's market or a craft market. Maybe you expand that and start doing larger Christmas shows, and maybe you do more than one. In those cases, you're selling direct to the end consumer yourself. So you are retailing the product. In that instance, you should be designing your product and your pricing with a wholesale price, and then adding on what is the cost of you actually retailing the product yourself. So what does it cost you to go to a craft market? What does it cost you in terms of hard costs, travel costs, and your time to actually do that retailing process yourself when you're selling direct to consumers? So that should give you an end retail price. What we find with a lot of craftspeople who make the decision to get into wholesale is the fact that many of them have not analyzed their pricing structure to an extent where they are really selling at a retail level when they're selling to the end consumer on their own. And in many cases, what we find is that the producer is actually selling to the end consumer at a wholesale price. Because if you haven't factored in all the elements that go into a pricing structure for your product, then chances are you've probably missed the components there of the cost of retail and a retail profit on your product if you're selling it direct to the consumer yourself. In the wholesale level, you're going to have your cost of production, the cost of selling wholesale. So that could be a wholesale trade show, it could be a website or an online platform. There's many different ways, and we'll explore some of those later. And then a wholesale profit. And it's interesting, if you're going to get into the wholesale market, you're going to have much more of a business format to the structure that you're doing. And profit is the number one thing that most people confuse with their labor and time spent making the product. So that becomes a really important element as well. If you are going to take your craft business further in terms of direct selling, whether that's to consumers at public events or also at, either online, then you need to factor in what is my profit, because my profit ultimately is going to be that portion when we talk about pricing that is going to help you move your business forward in the future. So there is definitely a difference between a wholesale price and the retail price. And we're going to look at those in more detail. So when you're selling directly to consumers yourself and you're doing retail, you have various lines of product, you're in your studio, you're making goods, and you're thinking, oh, wow, hopefully somebody's going to buy this. I hope they like the color. So you have a variety of items you're making. You go to a craft market or you have an online web shop of some kind. You upload all your items and you hope that people are going to buy your product. Now, obviously, the longer you've been doing this, the more experience you'll have in terms of identifying what sells, what doesn't sell. And it'll be the same thing if you get into the wholesale market. But at the retail level, it allows you to just sort of make whatever you like, just sit in your studio, make product. But for the most part, you're making and selling that product on speculation. You're hoping that somebody's going to buy that product at some point in time. Maybe if it's a new experimental product you're working on, maybe it'll take you a while for that to catch on. Maybe it's not the right color. Maybe it's not the right price point. But at that point, you're just making products and selling them. And your profit at that point should be on the production and the selling. And as I mentioned, when you start looking at the difference between retail pricing structures and wholesale pricing structures, a lot of people forget that selling cost is added on when you're direct retailing yourself. So the difference with wholesale, there are some very subtle differences in the process. So in wholesale, generally you create a wholesale product range. So you have a variety of items. You may even have collections or series or lines, they're often referred to. And for wholesale, generally, you'll only produce samples of the product. And at that point, you will contact retailers either through trade shows, through websites or web platforms now that have become popular in recent years, or you can cold call the retailers. You know a bunch of retailers in your province and you start calling them to see if they're interested in purchasing your work wholesale. So at that point in the wholesale process, you're working with product samples. You're not creating a studio full of product. You're only going to produce the product that retailers are actually interested in. So you create a product line or a product range, you show that to retailers, they place orders for future delivery, and then you go back to your studio and you fill those orders. So it becomes a bit of a different process. Obviously, once you get into doing an extensive amount of wholesale, then you can start projecting what are you going to need for the next 3, 6, 8, 12 months. And you can start forecasting what you need to produce. So it may not be always a situation where you're producing after you get the order. The two may go hand in hand in terms of sort of knowing and identifying when you need to produce something. Generally, for the most part, wholesale, not for the last 12 months. We're at the anniversary date this weekend of COVID lockdown and restrictions across the country. But prior, the standard practice in the wholesale industry is trade shows. We are now starting to see online platforms and virtual trade shows and other processes starting to come into the process. But for the most part, at this point in time, direct wholesale trade shows are the way in which most retailers in our sector are placing orders for product. The interesting thing here is that trade shows are not open to the public. They're only open to pre-qualified retailers. The retailers will go, they will look at your product samples. If they're interested, they may place an order at the show, or they may contact you after the trade show and place orders at some point in time in the future. The big difference here with wholesale is that there needs to be some kind of quality control and standardization. So if you're going to develop a product range or line, then it needs to be fairly consistent through all the items you're producing, because the retailers, if they get a successful product, they're going to want to reorder that product. So that's the process that you're looking at, is standardizing maybe shapes, sizes, or forms of items that you're producing, making sure there's consistent quality in what you're putting out, and so that retailers can easily reorder from you. So if you're a potter making mugs, maybe you have a small, medium, and large size mug. Maybe they come in 3 different colors. So that would be your range of coffee mugs. So thereby, you've standardized the size, and you've standardized the pricing, and the retailer can choose what they feel is going to work best for their retail environment. The other interesting element about wholesale is that you have no contact with the eventual customer. So you're selling your product at a wholesale price to a retailer. They are then going to mark it up and resell it in their retail shop. So this brings in several different elements, in that you're going to have to be constantly thinking about what it is, what is the retailer gravitating towards? What are they interested in purchasing? And that developing that relationship with the retailer is going to become very important to wholesale development, because you're going to be taking your cues and your advice based on what they're selling in their shops. And then you're collectively going to look at all the shops that would be selling your product and making decisions based on what's selling and what's not selling, in how you adjust your product range as you go forward. Here's a booth. Saskatchewan Craft Council has been participating in recent years in the Toronto Gift Show, now called the Toronto Gift and Home Market. And they have an incubator space, and this is the booth they have there. Craft Alliance, we also have an incubator space in Toronto as well. And we'll show you some images of those later on in the presentation. But I just wanted to sort of put this here, is that this is the sort of professional environment in which retail buyers go to look at product. And you'll see that this booth is not packed floor to ceiling, wall to wall, as you would see in a retail craft market. This is a wholesale show. So you can see just by the shelving on the back walls that they are individual selections by a group of different makers. And that's generally how you would present in the wholesale environment. So looking at the wholesale, your production now, because you're not retailing it direct, your profit rather, is going to be on production only. So the concept here is, yes, there may be a slimmer margin, but you're going to have that quality control and standardization of your product. You're going to do greater volume because you're dealing with multiple shops over a period of time. And the concept is to develop longevity as you go forward. So you're working with individual retailers, you're providing them with that quality control and standardization. You're making sure that you deliver on time, and that you're a consistent supplier to them. So your profit margin is going to be in that volume. So the key element there is, and what we're going to look at as we go forward talking about pricing structures and pricing strategies, is the fact that there may be product that you're producing currently that you just won't be able to wholesale. It won't make sense in terms of production time, production capacity, and the cost of producing the goods. So that's going to become something that you will see. And I noticed in the registration questions that we asked that there's a large mix in the participants that registered for today. There's a large range in people who are doing production-oriented work versus more contemporary one-of-a-kind work. And many people are doing a mixture of both. And that's great. That is a great way to diversify your craft practice and your craft business by working in different channels like that. So as you go forward with wholesale, and you develop product lines and ranges, and you start dealing with more retailers as you go forward, again, it's your decision what capacity you want to be able to build into your studio practice going forward. So, you know, if you decide, yeah, I'm going to go for it, I'm going to try to grow this business, and maybe I'll have 3 or 4 employees at some point in time, then your time as a business owner is going to be spent supervising people, training people, managing payroll, all those sort of other conventional business structures that go into, you know, running a business that may be more manufacturing oriented or production oriented than running a studio as a sole proprietor. But I think the important element here is creating a long-term plan and how you're going to approach it. We have many craftspeople that we've worked with in our region who do many different things. They may, you know, do a certain amount of wholesale, and they'll work on their production through the winter and sell that product through the spring and summer. And maybe other parts of the year, they'll focus on creating one-of-a-kind work, maybe for gallery exhibitions, or if they want to work, you know, with exhibition type galleries rather than craft shops or more direct retail. So again, going back to this issue of limited control or context in which your product is seen by the consumer, you're relying now on the retailer. So as you're designing and creating product ranges, you need to be thinking all the time, how is my product going to be seen on a store shelf? And sort of keeping that in context in terms of, do I need packaging? Do I need special labeling? If I'm doing an apparel product, do I need hand tags? So what are the elements in this process? And you're going to hear me come back to that over and over again. What are the key elements that help my product in telling my story to a consumer when it's on a store shelf and I'm not there in the booth selling the product myself? Once it goes into a store, retailers have free range to display and present the work however they wish to do that. So as part of that relationship building with the retailer, you want to make sure that you're able to tell your story and what that means. So generally, as I mentioned in the start, wholesale production, usually you get wholesale orders first, and then you produce the product. So this is going to affect cash flow as you're developing a wholesale business. And that is why you will often see many craftspeople will start off very slowly with with wholesale. Maybe you'll get 2 or 3 stores to start. You'll start doing wholesale. You'll figure out, does that work for me? Does it work for my production style and the type of work that I'm producing? And then you can go forward with it as you're doing that. But this is also going to affect your cash flow. If you're used to going out and doing craft markets, you do a Christmas craft market for 4 days, you make a certain amount of money, and then you invest that money in raw materials to make more product. So that is going to be a change. If you get into wholesale production, you're going to have to put out the expense or the investment in purchasing those raw materials to create the work to fill those orders. In the wholesale market, generally it's acceptable that retailers will pay for their first order when you ship it, but for the most case, retailers will expect to have credit terms of some kind. Most frequently, it's net 30 days in which to pay the account. So we'll talk a little bit more about that a bit later, but looking at wholesale, I think you have to be strategic in thinking about, okay, how am I going to make this work for the type of product that I'm producing? So looking at the product, and we talked about product ranges, product lines, collections, or series of products that you might want to offer to a retailer at the wholesale level, you need to do some research and strategic thinking about it, because the way in which you're making your craft product now may not be the way you'll have to make it if it's going to become more production oriented. So who do you want to reach with this product? And who is the end consumer? Are there ways in which I can improve my production capacity or my ability to produce items? And take a really hard look at that and look at what's happening in competition and in the general marketplace. So maybe visit some retail shops and find out what other craftspeople are doing and how they're doing it. And you'll be able to see, depending on what type of work you're producing, you'll be able to see very defined trends in terms of price points and the types of items that people are making and selling at the wholesale level. And again, when we start talking in detail about how to structure your pricing, I think you'll see that there'll become a point in time at which you'll have to make that decision as to whether you feel you can move forward with wholesaling those items based on the production time, raw materials, and so on. So we will look at some of those. So are there ways in which you can either increase the speed of production? I tell most people, if you're going to do a wholesale, you need to figure out a way of creating multiples of products. I come from a jewelry background myself and had a jewelry business for many years, and it was production oriented. And I would never sit down and make one pair of earrings ever because I was trying to do volume wholesale and do production. So I had a hydraulic press. I would stamp out shapes, and then the shapes would be altered or finished in different ways. And thereby I have increased my capacity in production by having some other, production oriented process that I've introduced to what I'm doing. So those are things you're going to have to start considering as you're designing a specific range of product to suit the wholesale market. So some other challenges that you may face in terms of the design of your product and what is suitable for the market. I talked about the fact that you're not going to have that one-on-one interaction with the end consumer. So aesthetics is going to be really important in your product. So when your product is sitting on the shelf, what do customers see? Is there something about your product that makes it unique and different? Does your product need an explanation? If somebody picks up your product, do they know what it is? Is it a functional object? Is it something wearable? And is that readily understandable when someone picks up the item in a store. So that, you know, if that's the case where your product, you know, someone picks up and says, oh, what the heck is this? Then you need to evaluate and say, okay, maybe I need to do something to enhance my product through packaging or labeling or some other manner, so that the story of the product and its use and function is conveyed to the consumer while it's, you know, in a store environment. You need to be constantly in the wholesale market looking at what's happening around you. And tomorrow we're going to be talking about trends and different markets that we visited, and show you lots of images of product. And that becomes a really critical element if you want to develop wholesale, is knowing what's going on in the marketplace. You know, if everybody's buying blue pottery and you're making orange pottery, then that kind of doesn't make a lot of sense for the wholesale market, if that is what retailers are looking for at any given time. So I think the interesting thing about the craft industry is the fact that as small producers and makers, you have the ability to pivot and do different things at different times. Yeah, you may have to do research if it's pottery or some other product that, you know, maybe, you know, obviously with pottery, you've got different glazing techniques and processes. So that may take a bit of work and research and development in creating those new surfaces for products. But again, you have the ability to do that, whereas larger scale manufacturers, you know, may take them a lot longer to analyze and look at what's happening in the market and be able to react. So looking at ways that you can produce your work in a more competitive way, and be able to build in those elements that you need for the wholesale market. The one thing I found when I was wholesaling jewelry is that you're constantly looking for new items and you're constantly reevaluating your pricing structure. And that's going to be an ongoing thing as you progress into the wholesale market. The other thing in looking at is identifying what types of retail you should be selling into. So for the most part, the craft industry is considered a consumer product. It generally, for the most part, sells in the giftware industry. So gift shops, craft shops, museum shops, that type of a retail environment is where most of the product is sold, especially in Canada. So if you've got a product that maybe suits some other kind of retail environment, then you may have to look at, you know, how do I get into that market? How do I access it? And is there something about my product that needs to be changed or altered to suit that market? Or vice versa, if you don't think your product as it currently sits suits the giftware industry and those types of shops that I mentioned, then maybe you need to go out and find another market segment that'll work for your type of product. And I have to say, over the years, I've traveled so much around the world that I can guarantee you right now, there isn't a market anywhere where you can't find a market for your product, no matter what it is and no matter what price point. It just, that may not be your own backyard. And we find that here in Atlantic Canada. We have, you know, several thousand craft producers in our region, and many craftspeople, especially if they're doing more contemporary one-of-a-kind work, they often have to go further afield to find the right type of retail environment or gallery environment in which to sell their work. And that just might be a reality if you know, intend on continuing to produce that type of work that maybe is not totally suited for your current marketplace. Here's I want to just show you a couple of examples of this. And this is a company based in Nova Scotia called Larchwood Enterprises. And Larchwood has actually been around for, I'm actually not sure, 30 or 40 years. They are actually a hardwood flooring manufacturer. in Nova Scotia. They're in rural Cape Breton Island. They actually own a wood mill. They actually own their own forest where they harvest larch trees. And they have been doing that for a very long period of time. Their products are very well known in the building and construction industry. And about 12 years ago, they literally had a massive barn filled with offcuts. So in the pre-finished flooring world of hardwood flooring, everything is cut to very standardized dimensions and sizes based on what's happening in the building industry. So they had all these offcuts or end cuts of wood, and they didn't have the heart because they had been kiln dried and milled, and they didn't have the heart to throw them away. And so at one point they said, well, what are we going to do with this stuff? And everyone was throwing ideas around, and they said, well, why don't we just make something out of it? And so some guys in their production facility glued up some boards and made a cutting board, and there you have it. And so when they started this, they literally had a square, a rectangle, and a circle. They had 3 items, and they did them each in 3 different sizes. So automatically they had 9 items to start wholesaling from day one. So they started their production. We produce a wholesale trade show in Atlantic Canada, in Toronto, and they started wholesaling their product in craft and gift shops. And the product immediately did very well, and it started to take off. And so they started looking to export markets, and what are we going to do next? So there's going to be a point at which our cutting boards, we'll probably sell some, but how big can we go? And because they had been doing hardwood flooring, they have a large production facility. They had employees that maybe were not employed year round because, they would do runs of hardwood flooring, and then, the workshop might sit idle for periods of time when it's not as busy. So as they brought this forward, they were then able to employ more people in their production facility on a full-time basis. So basically, it started out with 3 items, and it started to grow. So as they grew and progressed, they started diversifying into other markets. So they're all individually handmade boards. They started in the craft and gift market, and then they started to expand from there. Eventually, they moved into housewares, they moved into restaurants and hospitality, and they started to grow the business. And now they're at the point where they have about 12 full-time permanent employees. They're producing a much wider range of boards. The restaurant and hospitality industry, professional chefs started ordering, you'll see in the image here on the left, large prep counters, and they're even doing interiors for home kitchens now. So because they had this production facility for hardwood flooring, they have the capability to do very large projects. So as they went forward, you'll see the boards on the bottom left there, the smaller boards, those became sushi serving boards. They were at a restaurant and hospitality trade show in Chicago a few years ago, and they were approached by a chain of sushi restaurants who wanted to put prep counters, and they wanted a customized board for their restaurants. So they placed a huge order. Larchwood is now, if anybody is familiar with the American-based kitchen store chain, Williams-Sonoma, they are now in 400 Williams-Sonoma stores across North America. So this has really grown into a huge enterprise and a huge business. They do trade shows all over North America. They now have sales reps in the European Union, and they've even sold as far away as Australia and Asia. So it's really become a very large, and this is sort of an extreme example, but it is possible to do it. They took this simple idea and sort of expanded on it over a period of time. So there's lots of diverse markets that you go into, and we're going to talk about some of those in our trend session tomorrow. So design challenges. So always looking for solutions. If you're going to create a wholesale product range, there's a lot of elements that you can consider. Is there a seasonality to your product? Is there something about the materials? I've often heard, candle makers, I can't ship my stuff in the winter, everything will freeze and crack. That's a challenge for your product. So how are you going to address that? Do you have a product that only sells in the winter or for the Christmas season? Maybe you have something that's more applicable to spring and summer. So those seasonality issues will then, become part of how you develop your wholesale market. So you may only produce those items at certain times of the year. So looking ahead and staying on trends or what's happening in the marketplace. And, we often say that craft often doesn't, because it's unique and it's individual and it's handmade, that it doesn't have to follow trends. And for the most part, in many cases when consumers are purchasing handmade goods, they're not looking necessarily for what's on trend. But I think it's something in terms of just being aware of what's happening in the marketplace, and being able to react to that in some way, shape, or form. The one thing you're going to encounter in the wholesale market is that retailers are going to want something new all the time. So once you start developing that relationship with a retailer, every time you talk to them, they're going to be asking you, so what's new? If you go to a trade show, we hear that all the time when we travel to shows. And so as a producer, you have to be thinking, how am I going to carry that forward into the future? This is another Nova Scotia-based company, Basic Spirit Pewter. They've grown that from a husband and wife into a very large company, and they are selling all across, mostly North America. They haven't really moved beyond the North American market. And that's personally by choice. They wanted to keep the business at a certain size and scale. But they're producing pewter products, which are, compared to other handcrafted products, there is a reproduction process. They do use molds. So they are able to sort of standardize products. They're able to do theme-based or seasonal products. So they tend to categorize things as they produce them. So they will have within their catalog or product range, they may have 10 different categories of products, and then they subdivide them from there. And then you'll get breaks out, various breakouts in terms of price points for the products that they're producing as well. So in terms of developing products specifically for the wholesale market, you really need to be designing with wholesale in mind. How am I going to produce it? Can I do multiples? What is that going to look like? What is my pricing strategy for those products? And how can I move that forward? The easiest ways that most people that get into wholesale is just extend your existing product line in what you're already doing. I mentioned a small, medium, large sized coffee mug. That's a very easy way to extend a product line, is to introduce a different size, shape, or form of an item to the market. And that will allow you to introduce maybe a new price point, maybe even a new production process or technique that you're using. And that will also help you create new markets and innovate product as well. So that's where most people really start, with expanding their product line. And then does that lead to something else? Is there some other, something else in the process of the type of work I do, whether it's pottery or jewelry or woodwork or textiles? Is there some innovation that's happening in my particular segment of craft that I can innovate and add to my product? Look at new types of materials. This is a really interesting area because we're now seeing a big upsurges in recycling, reusing, upcycling raw materials made from other materials that have been repurposed or recycled. So that becomes a really interesting element in innovation, is how can you introduce something of that type to the product range that you're offering? And buyers are looking for that. You know, right now you see, you know, bamboo is a hot textile that's on the market. So when you start looking at, you know, what's innovative, what's new in raw materials, is there some way I can introduce some of those elements into what I'm doing? And collaborative work, I always recommend to people, you know, you saw the previous picture of a Basic Spirit cutting board in the shape of a fish. Well, Basic Spirit Pewter doesn't make wood cutting boards. So they're partnering in a collaboration with someone else who is actually making the wood boards for them. And then they're just attaching their pewter handles that they're producing to the cutting board. So that's a collaboration. So that's also a way that you can innovate and enter new markets with new types of products. So we've talked about a bit about wholesale and sort of what it's about. And so we're going to talk a bit about pricing strategies, and how to determine where you should go with pricing. So the one element that we see a lot with new crafts producers that want to enter wholesale is that whole element of, am I pricing my product properly? In many cases, we find no, that often prices are lower than they should be, or not at a market retail price. So we really recommend that craftspeople look at what it is that you're offering, and what is the price that you've been currently selling it for, and is that a realistic price in the marketplace? So looking at what is a customer going to pay for? So again, that element of wholesale not having that contact with the end consumer, you need to tell a story about your product. So what will customers pay for? Definitely number one is story. So if there's something about you as a maker, the story about how you got to where you are, or the story about why you're making the product you're making, or it could be a story with respect to the process or technique. Maybe there's something special or unique about your process that you're using, and that can become the story of your product. People are looking for value for money, and that has been really evident in the past 12 months as people have been in lockdown at home. People are looking for functionality, they're looking for value, but they're also looking for quality materials. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they want the cheapest thing in the market. People will pay for quality products if they feel that there's value in what they're getting. So you need to have well-designed, well-made products, and well-researched in terms of how you're going to produce them. Those elements will always add value to the price of your goods. If there's some form of cultural significance, so what is your personal background, and is there something culturally significant that adds to your story and maybe adds to the significance of the product that you're producing, then that can be an element that will also enhance the value and the end price, but it'll also increase the perceived value that people have about the work that you're doing. It should obviously be well finished. In the wholesale market, it's really important that you have some kind of brand recognition. So if you're going to get into wholesale, make sure you have a proper business name, a logo, maybe some kind of visual identity, so that when people start identifying your product, they can, anytime they see it in other stores, they're going, oh, wow, you know, this person is in this store. Appropriate packaging, hang tags. So again, those identifiers that are really important to telling the story of your product. So, you know, we're in an environment right now in 2021 where, you know, many people and producers of any kind of product are starting to look at zero waste and what is eco-friendly, what is helping to reduce carbon footprint. So all of those things are going to become important considerations when you're doing it. So we don't want tons of unnecessary packaging and labeling, but if it's going to help enhance the story, that will also enhance the value and the sale of the goods, then it's something that you need to look at and consider. So in the wholesale market, it's really important that you also start thinking in terms of pricing strategies. I always recommend to people who are new to wholesale that you have a range of items and a range of price points, because if you're just starting out in the wholesale marketplace, you may not know exactly what type of store is going to do best with your product. So every store that's out there on the planet, they have a target market, they have a target customer. I guarantee you every retailer you ever meet or introduce to will be able to tell you what the average register sale is in their shop. They will also probably be able to tell you a range of price points within the range of sales they have in their shop that are most effective for them. So if you're only producing 5 items and they're all within a very narrow range of price points, then the chances are, become less and less that you may appeal to a broader range of retailers. So that becomes a really critical element in designing that range of products that you have and having various prices and pricing strategies that will help you appeal to a broader range of retailers. And then as you go forward and start working with more retailers, then you can start to sort of parse that out and say, okay, I'm seeing where my key audiences are and what the key price points are. And you can start specifically developing product with those types of stores and those types of price points in mind. So a well thought out pricing scheme will really help you grow over the long term, because it will help you with identifying, what are the issues, what are the price points that are most successful. You will always find that, I used to have a $12 pair of earrings, and they were my bread and butter earrings. I could make hundreds and hundreds of pairs of those earrings. And I would always sell them because it was a lower price point than the regular items that I had, but I could produce those earrings by the hundreds. So that became a critical price point, and it became a price point for cash flow purposes. So as long as I had that one particular item at a very affordable price point, then I knew that there would always be cash flow and revenue coming in. So understanding why and how price points vary by type of retailer and by type of sector becomes really important, because, if you're in a high volume tourist area, they may be looking for lower price points because they're trying to appeal to a tourist audience that maybe is not intending on spending money, but they might drop $15 or $20 or $30 if they see something they really like. But it may be more questionable to them if it's a higher price point. Whereas you may have other shops, maybe a retail shop that is only handmade, or maybe it's more of a gallery environment. Museum gift shops. Museum gift shops are a really interesting element that we've been working in recent years, and we find that that has a huge broad range of products, again, depending on the size and scale of the museum. But they can have items for $2 or $3, but they can also have items for $2,000 or $3,000. And again, it depends on the environment that it's sitting in, but it's really important going into a wholesale market that you understand that these realities exist and that they may vary depending on the type of environment and retail store that you sell in. I mentioned larch wood cutting boards. Well, they're now selling in 4 or 5 different industry segments. So they're selling in craft and gift, they're selling in housewares, they're selling in restaurant and hospitality. And each of those sectors have different critical price points. They also have different profit margins, which becomes really critical. We see this a lot with handmade soaps, handmade candles, items that might be a lower price point, more of a consumable good rather than pottery or jewelry or some other item. But we often see this with those types of products because they appeal to much broader ranges of retailers. So here in Atlantic Canada, we have a lot of soap makers, and the soap makers, they may do really well in craft shops, but many of them are also selling at the local pharmacy or the local grocery store, or a local farmer's market. And those environments are going to have very different types of retail markup. So that's going to be very important for you to research all those elements and make sure that you're consistent across everything you're doing. So if you're going to sell into different types of retail stores, you want to make sure that there's not huge variances in pricing, because consumers, most frequently nowadays, consumers hop online and they start figuring things out pretty easily if prices are different from place to place. So again, type of retail outlet. Are you direct retailing it yourself? Is it a market affair? You'll see some examples there of different types of retail and retail segments. All of these have, very specific retail stores that can be part of these segments. So part of your research process in a pricing strategy is figuring out, okay, where's my product best suited within the marketplace. As you get into wholesale, usually immediately, this is not that important, but I put this on the slide, intermediaries. The gift industry, for example, is highly, especially in the United States market, is highly organized by sales reps, distribution networks, wholesale showrooms, other types of mechanisms for wholesaling your product. And every step of the way, there is a profit margin. So sales reps get paid a portion of wholesale. So if you were to look at those elements as you go forward, then you're going to have to adjust your pricing, because that's going to become part of the cost of doing business with your product. So another element, I just sort of alluded to the US market, but there could be different pricing strategies, whether you're selling locally on the prairies, or if you're selling across Canada, or if you're looking at export markets. There could be very different types of retail and different types of retail markups as you go into those markets. Obviously, in export markets, you're then going to have to look at what is the cost of exporting, and then also what currency am I doing business in when I export to another country. So that will become an important element. If you're continuing to do wholesale and you're going to do direct to consumer retail, making sure that your pricing and your product is consistent across the market. We've seen in the last year everyone jumping online, whether it's on their own website or social media or a platform like Etsy and the thousands of other platforms that have evolved over the past year or so. You need to make sure that you're consistent, and retailers, once you get into wholesale, retailers are going to be looking for that consistency. There's an understanding in the craft and giftware industry that markup in Canada is generally 100% of cost. So if a retailer pays $20, it's understood, $20 wholesale, it's understood that that item will sell for around $40 retail. That is not the case everywhere you go, and you're going to find differences. But if you are going to be wholesaling, then those retailers are going to be expecting that you're selling it at the $40 level, not at a $20 level when you're doing direct retail on your own. So I mentioned down there showrooming. That's a process where shoppers do comparative shopping online now. Pretty well any major big box store you go into, people are on their phones, and what they're doing is they're looking at pricing and they're trying to find out, can I get this less expensive somewhere else? So, and that happens in the craft and the art world as well. People are always looking to see, what's the markup in this environment. And omni-channel marketing is just a reference to making sure that whatever you're doing, if you're selling online, if you're selling through social media channels or through wholesale, that you're being consistent across everything you're doing and how you're doing it. If a retailer at the wholesale level makes the decision on their own to increase that margin and charge more than 100% markup, then there's really nothing you can do about that. That's, once they buy the product, it's theirs. They can charge whatever they like for it. I would say when you're starting out, if you're consistently seeing retailers charging significantly more than 100% markup, then maybe you need to go back and reevaluate. Wait a second, maybe my prices are, under market prices for whatever it is you're selling. So it's good to make sure that you know that before you start engaging with retailers at a wholesale level. So pricing strategies at the wholesale level. So again, low, medium, high, so small, medium, large. You can obviously, within any product range you're creating, you can create different price points. You can simply do it by size, shape, or context, changing a color, changing a process, and you can easily do that. I don't recommend that people have too many items starting out in wholesale. You don't want to overwhelm the retailers, but you want to provide, enough range and enough product selection so that they have, a decent cross section of what you're marketing or selling at the wholesale level for their shops. So that becomes important as well. I do know some people that I am thinking of a potter in Nova Scotia who's just doing cat mugs right now, and that's her big wholesale item, is a mug in the shape of a cat, and they're selling wildly crazy. But that's kind of a trend thing. That's kind of, she's hit on a price point and a cute character that works for her. So she's at the moment taking advantage of that. So, but it shows that a wholesale product line doesn't have to be 50 items. You don't have to be producing thousands of them in the run of a year. You really have to look at the wholesale market as sort of a context, a concept, and how you work as a maker. So you can have wholesale production and you can do it at certain times of the year and be successful with it, but still carve out time to do other things that you're interested in doing as well. So competition becomes really important. In the last few years when we've been doing trade shows, it's jewelry. And I apologize to any jewelers on the call, but when we go to trade shows, every other booth is jewelry. So if you're going to wholesale jewelry, what do you got to do? You got to have something really interesting. It's got to be something retailers haven't seen before. If you really want to get their attention and get wholesale orders, then it's obviously something in the marketplace that's happening right now, and you need to be aware of it. 4 or 5 years ago in Atlantic Canada, we had so many soap makers. They were like coming out of the woodwork. So what do you do about that? Well, you have to innovate with your soap making if that's the case, and stand out amongst the crowd of jewelers or soap makers at any given time, so that your product stands out. And I always recommend to people, if you're going to get into a new market, go investigate that market first. So I never tell anybody to go to a wholesale trade show without knowing something about that event first. So if you have the ability to travel to a wholesale trade show. Most trade shows will let in prospective exhibitors to view the show. They'll give you an industry guest pass in some form, and you can go check it out. And you know, when we travel to the US a lot under normal circumstances, not in them at the moment, but normally we travel to trade shows in the US. And when you walk a show over and over, you start to identify where those unique products are in terms of color, form, shape, texture. I can tell you, you know, we do a show in New York twice a year, and you know, there's no basic silver jewelry at that show. Let me just put it that way. You know, the jewelry is all, it's got color, or it's got unusual materials. Maybe it's acrylic or leather or some other element to it that makes it interesting to the buyers. So that becomes, you know, a really important element. Market demand. So obviously, jewelry as in hot demand. You know, if you look at some of the trend studies that have been done in recent years, there was a point in time as soon as even 10 or 12 years ago where jewelry was considered a specialty. You know, you had to go to a certain type of store to get nice quality jewelry. Well, jewelry's now become a mainstream product, and you know, you can find really high quality jewelry pretty much in any type of store in any type of market. From gift and craft and gallery to apparel to accessories. It really runs the gamut. So obviously there's market demand. So that's a really important element. So while it may sound discouraging to some jewelers that, wow, there's tons of jewelry in the market, but that also becomes an opportunity because obviously there's market demand and you can take advantage of that if you're willing to innovate and do something that maybe people have not seen before. Perception is another element. We're going to talk specifically about types of pricing. Perception can be a big part of, especially unique handmade products. Perception can add a lot to the value and price tag of an item. So that becomes really important for you to be aware of, and is that something that is important to what I'm doing? And finally, in pricing strategies for wholesale is constantly reevaluating. I mentioned that often people come in with a really broad range. I've seen some of our new exhibitors come in with 40 or 50 items, and then within a year, 18 months, you start seeing them scale back what they're offering in wholesale because they figured it out. They figured, okay, I've got these 10 items. These 10 items are my best sellers, and I'm going to work that and see how I can do with it. So it's this sort of process of constantly reevaluating what you're doing in the market. So how do niche markets affect your price? So market pricing is where you are responding to market demands or influences, often employed as raw materials and labor are often a smaller portion of the overall price of the good. So we see that very frequently with one-of-a-kind work or something that's very unique and specialized, and maybe the labor component is much larger component than the raw materials. So there is some leeway there based on what people perceive or how they value the piece of work that will allow you to increase the price. So that's an important element to consider as well. The larchwood cutting boards I showed you, their lowest wholesale price point is around $68. So that means most of their items are retailing for at least 140 or more. Their larger cutting boards are retailing upwards of $600 or $700. That's really exceptional for a wholesale product to be able to go into a market wholesale in volume at that price point. That is, but it can be done. Obviously, they're doing it, and they've been doing it for over a dozen years now. So, you know, it can be a matter of just figuring out where is the market I need to go to make that work for me. So telling the story of your product, making sure high quality and finish. Is there something about the process, technique, or materials? You know, years ago, I remember when a lot of potters started getting into smoke firing and pit firing and raku. Those techniques had not been frequently seen, and they were very unusual. They were very unique. Obviously, they were very beautiful in how they were done and finished. So that, you know, added value to the price and the perception of the product. So that attributes to increasing the price. The reputation of the maker becomes really important. And I think that becomes something that you'll see going forward, is that whole brand and name recognition is really critical if you're trying to get your pricing structure to increase. Then that reputation, quality, and perceived value are going to become really important elements. Demand and pricing increases slow over time, especially the higher price point you go in wholesale, the longer it's going to take for that to sort of connect over a period of time. So what is a pricing structure in terms of wholesale? So we talked about the fact that many people coming into the wholesale market have not considered maybe all elements of what goes into the price of their product. So we're going to look at some of those. So materials, labor, your overhead costs, your selling costs become a really important element, and then profit. So if you're in this as a business, you need to be considering that you need to have some margin of profit in your pricing structure, because that's what you're going to use to move you forward. The labor element often gets confused with the profit in the business. And so we really advise people to look at those in greater detail as you're developing your pricing structure. I'm not someone who necessarily agrees with pricing formulas in general, but we'll show you just a couple of examples just to sort of lead you in a direction. The reason I'm not a fan of pricing formulas is that, having run a production jewelry business, it can really mislead you at times in terms of what your margin is on a product and what margin do you really need to make that a viable product. So I think it's very valuable in the process for individual makers to do what we'll talk about as being cost pricing, because of the fact that you do really need to know what all your costs and raw materials are as you go forward. So if you look at the items we mentioned in the previous slide, like materials, labor, overhead costs, selling costs, and profit, that should really be a wholesale price. And then, as we mentioned earlier, generally wholesale times 2 will be a retail price. In the giftware industry, it's known as keystoning, though that margin can be higher. In the US market right now, standard keystone is 2.5 times cost. So when you look at that and say, okay, what's my wholesale price? You have to make sure that all those elements of your pricing structure are built into that wholesale price, including the profit item. So you can do it that way as sort of a generalized. Some people also use what's referred to as unit cost pricing. So actually breaking down every element that goes into the production of an item. So if it's pottery, it is the clay, the wedging of the clay, the throwing of the clay, you know, all the steps that go into it, bisque firing, glaze firing. So looking at all those individual costs and what are they to determine an end unit cost per item. So that gives you a better sense of what is it actually costing me to produce that item. And then often with unit cost pricing, when the producer has been able to realize, okay, we've got our materials and labor, and then usually they will add a percentage for overhead, profit, and selling costs to determine an end wholesale price. I think when you're starting out, I think it's a really, really valuable exercise to start with unit cost pricing so that you really understand what it's costing you to produce that individual item. Though you may be producing items in multiples or duplicates, it's still really important to know what is it costing me to do that. So market pricing formula, this again goes back to that whole niche market element, which does apply to many craft items, especially if you're looking for a mid to higher end price point. Look at market-based pricing, so the cost of the product. So maybe either doing a unit cost pricing or some other combination of adding up your direct costs of production. And maybe there is some kind of market price or premium that's added to the product that then elevates it to whatever that final price is that you're looking to get. I remember years ago running a gallery. I've got lots of friends that are potters, so I tend to talk about pottery a lot. So I apologize to the non-potters in the group, but teapots are, I think, a really good example of a premium product because there's many components to a teapot. Teapots take time to make. They have many parts. There's a thrown base, there's a spout, there's a handle, there's a lid. It's got to pour properly. So there's a lot of elements there, and many potters, if they're going to get into making teapots, they will charge a premium price because of the time and labor and the fact that because of the price, maybe they don't sell as many. So they will sort of factor in a market pricing situation so that they're getting a premium price for it, and that will result in them not maybe having to produce as many at the same time. So the price is added to the cost of the product due to market factors like competitor products, or there could even be a price sensitivity with some products. So it really depends on what the product is and what market you may be selling that product into. If it's a gallery market that you're looking at in terms of selling one-of-a-kind work, then that has a whole other element. The reputation and the process of the maker really become an important element of determining what those market prices will be. I'd also point out with that pricing is we find a lot of people getting into wholesale have possibly been pricing at what their local market will bear for the product. And that is always not a good indicator. I can speak for Atlantic Canada because we've been here a long time, and Atlantic Canada doesn't have the most robust economy in the country. And oftentimes we will see craftspeople selling a product for what they think they can get for it. And often when you get into wholesale, that might work okay on some level if you're doing direct to consumer retail. But as soon as you enter the wholesale marketplace, it's like, oh, wait a second. They suddenly realize, wow, I'm not making any money off this product. So looking at some of the individual, I like to point out to people, because it's one thing to say, count up all your materials and your time and your labor and all your costs, but there are many elements, especially when you get into wholesale, because that margin is so much slimmer, that you really need to be aware of everything you're doing. So all your raw materials, everything from packing, shipping materials, any kind of material presentation, any kind of material preparation that must be done, then you need to make sure that you're accounting for all of those items. Looking at ways to minimize waste. And again, that lends itself to, can I do multiples? Is there some way I can increase the volume and capacity of what I'm doing, but wastage becomes a critical element because you could be potentially throwing dollars down the drain if there isn't some way to either repurpose the waste or use it in some other way. So larchwood cutting boards, they basically were repurposing waste from their hardwood flooring business. And, so they got into doing something else. Tools and replacement are really important part of it. Regulatory costs, if you have a product that requires, if you're doing a food product, if you're doing a healthcare product, if you're doing children's clothing, children's toys, there's lots of regulatory requirements out there for product testing and labeling. And it's your responsibility as a producer to know what those are and have that work done as part of your product development process. Found materials, so there's lots of people basket making and other processes where people are foraging or repurposing and recycling is a big part of making nowadays. That also has a time element and a cost associated with it. So you need to be aware of that and how you're going to proceed. Get the best possible price for all your raw materials. Most frequently, the best way to do that is direct from the manufacturer. I guarantee you, if you're buying raw materials from a local supplier in small quantities, you're probably potentially paying 3 or 4 times the price you should be paying for those items. And that's all based on distribution and supply chains. If you're buying it direct from the manufacturer, then there's nobody in between. There's no sales reps, there's no distributors, and so on. So that becomes a really important element. And we've often found that craftspeople getting into wholesale, it becomes a real issue because then there's a cash flow situation because of the fact that you must buy certain raw materials in bulk. When I was doing jewelry, I would only order silver wire usually once, maybe twice a year, and it would come from a supplier in the United States. So yeah, that had a big outlay of cost to do it, but that helped in the long run in terms of getting the individual unit cost of producing those pieces of jewelry down to a level where it was reasonable and profitable to wholesale the product. So the value of your work in terms of labor, don't forget non-productive time. So time spent on the computer, time spent at craft shows, time spent foraging or looking for materials or prepping materials, loading the kiln, driving to the post office. Those are all elements that people tend to not think about. So if you live in a rural area, an hour from a post office, then that becomes a real cost. And maybe you only need to be going to the post office once every 2 or 3 weeks or once a month. It's really going to depend on what your personal situation is and how much you're actually producing. And in terms of labor, are you working effectively as you can? So that whole concept of, can I do multiples? Can I do a production-oriented way of doing wholesale product? There is a process called lean manufacturing. I won't get into too many details about it, but if you're someone who's very process-oriented, then you can Google lean manufacturing and it'll tell you all about how to develop manufacturing processes. And don't undervalue your time. Starting out, you may pay yourself a little bit less, and then as you build over time and grow and increase your business, you can start to add on to that. But I've seen people come up with pricing strategies where they actually didn't even include their labor. It was like, oh, well, I'm making these things and I'm not really paying attention to how much time it takes me. So once you enter that wholesale market, that becomes a really important element. Overhead. So, if people are starting and working from a home studio, maybe there aren't as many overhead issues or things that you're going to account for right off the bat. But as you move forward in wholesale, and if you're trying to grow that wholesale business, then it becomes really important, because maybe you need to move out to a garage or a barn, or maybe you need to rent studio space at some other location. So that becomes more important as you go forward, but also looking at all the other elements of phone, hydro, gas, service charges, credit cards, service fees for providers. So if you're paying for things like website hosting, cloud storage, all of those elements are going to feed into the overall overhead in your product development. And selling costs, looking at what are the methods of distribution that you're marketing and selling your product. Are you doing wholesale trade shows? Are you continuing to do the retail side of your business? Many craftspeople, I find, once they get into wholesale, often people will stop retailing whatever they're wholesaling, so that the wholesale items are sort of exclusive to their retailers. But again, that's going to be a determination you make as you go forward, and depending on whether that makes sense for the range of items you want to do. If your main goal and objective with a studio practice is to do one-of-a-kind work, then yeah, maybe you do your wholesale production at a certain time of the year, and you limit that, and that brings in revenue to assist you in doing the other work you'd like to do. So all the other elements of selling costs, from advertising, promotion, marketing, online development, those kinds of things are all part of your selling costs. So what constitutes profit? So profit is what's left over after everything is covered. It's your surplus to grow your business, and ensures that you have survival for the future. And that's the money you're going to reinvest in your business to grow your business. So if you're starting off small and you feel the only way I can grow a wholesale business is through investing in new equipment, or maybe it's moving out of your house and into a studio, then that becomes the profit then becomes a really key element to how you're going to do that. So pricing, you want to make sure that you're being realistic with it. As I mentioned earlier, if you're finding that your prices are too high for your local market, then maybe your local market is not the market for that product. So maybe you need to specifically find a market, find a product that works for that local market. And then maybe this other product, you will research and find some other market for it, whether that's wholesale or retail or gallery, whatever the case may be. If your prices, if you still think they're too high, you can either not make them for wholesale and keep them for direct retail on your own. You could look at ways of doing multiples and cutting your production costs. Or some people intentionally lower their profit margin on individual items just so they sell better. And if you have the capacity to reproduce those in multiples, then possibly there's a way to make that work in terms of the wholesale market. So you can lower your prices if you want to attract new business as well. That's something you can see in the general retail and consumer marketplace outside of the craft industry. Lots of businesses will lower prices just to get a new audience of people and generate new interest. So that can be done in the gift industry as well. Loss leaders, so that's a volume strategy. So I mentioned my $12 earrings. That was purely a volume strategy. It was to generate cash flow, and it was an item that I could produce in quantity at a very low individual unit cost price for the item. So some of the realities, you need to be consistent in wholesale. Make sure you have consistent quality in production and standardization. Generally in the wholesale trade, retailers most frequently they will accept a 1-year price increase. Most people, if they're looking at increasing their prices, will do that in January because that's the start of the buying year for a calendar year. But retailers will start to question what you're doing if every time they go to place an order, you're increasing your prices. That's really a no-no in the wholesale world. Unless there's something, drastic that happens. But then I would say, if that happens and you're finding, wow, suddenly my prices are jumping 30 or 40%, and you're going to end up in a different price point category, then I would say you need to reanalyze and say, okay, is there something I can replace that with? So if $35 retail was a really, really good price point for you, and suddenly your prices are increasing to $40 or $45, then I would say you need to look at that and say, okay, is there something else I could be doing at the $35 price point? Because obviously that was a place at which your consumers were finding an optimal price. Other wholesale strategies in the gift industry, volume discounts. So some of these you may not encounter because obviously if you're doing handmade items, and there may not be the room to do that, but some in the general manufactured giftware industry, volume discounts are actually quite frequent. Some of the pewter companies we've worked with have offered volume discounts because they can reproduce in multiples in a larger fashion. So sometimes if you buy 5 dozen of something, then they'll offer you like a 5% discount. Guaranteed sale is a situation where the producer of the goods is guaranteeing the sale. For the most part in craft, we don't see that too often. Where I have seen it is in apparel. Often if a retailer gets some colors or styles maybe that were not popular with their audience of customer, then they might start asking if they can swap them out for something else. That is purely up to you whether you even want to go down that road with people. If it's a retailer that does really, really well with your product, then you might want to consider it. If blue and purple scarves were hot for summer 2020, then maybe orange scarves are not the thing, and maybe they would like to exchange those. And again, once they purchase at wholesale, it's up to you whether you want to enact a policy like that. But it's something to think about when you get into wholesale. If you've got a product that might have a seasonality or a color or something unique about it that might question whether it sells in the store, you may get questioned by retailers about that. Minimum orders in wholesale. So it's very common in the wholesale. You don't necessarily want to be shipping a retailer 5 items. So it's advisable starting out, especially that you have some kind of a minimum order. It can be a dollar value, 200, 500, whatever the case may be. It can be a minimum order of items on an individual basis. So rather than ordering 1 or 2 coffee mugs, it's a 6 mug minimum, something in that fashion. Trade shows, a couple of items about trade shows. Trade show specials, if you're going to a trade show, often producers will have special items offered at the show that the retailer can only purchase at the show. And that's really just an incentive to get them to place an order at the trade show, because we know that not all retailers will do that. Free shipping is a very common thing. So if you place an order with me when I'm at a trade show, your first order will get free shipping. So any kinds of incentives that you might think of that might be applicable to your type of product. The greeting card industry, the book industry and publishing often have things like guaranteed sale, volume discounts, and they're mostly incentives to get retailers to commit to buying the product. Exclusivity is something you may encounter, especially when you start out in wholesale. Retailers looking to have the exclusive right to sell your product in a specific city or region or province. That is something that comes with a lot of pros and cons. If you're starting out in wholesale, you may not be aware of where the best places to sell your product are. So it may be dangerous for you to get into an exclusivity agreement with a retailer when you don't really know the market that well. However, on the flip side of that, if it is the type of store where your product could do well, then it actually could be a bonus for you. I find right now too many retailers ask for exclusivity without any purpose. They just want to be the only person selling that product. If you're starting out in wholesale, it's kind of scary to put all your eggs in one basket and rely on one particular retailer to sell your product. So that's really going to have to be a decision you make in terms of, what's your reach? How far are you trying to go? Is your goal to have 5 or 10 retailers, or is your goal to have 30 or 40 retailers? If you're looking to be, over a much broader range of the prairies or Western Canada or Central Canada, then you may have to examine that and say, okay, I will give you exclusivity for Winnipeg, or I will give you exclusivity for downtown Toronto or something of that nature. But you may not want to give them carte blanche for maybe a whole province, because there could be dozens of other retail shops in that province where your product could be where your product could sell even better. So ultimately, you have to, as a producer, decide whether you can wholesale your product or not. You have to really evaluate your production process and how you're going to go about doing wholesale, counting all your costs and deciding whether it makes sense. I think it's very, very easy for craftspeople to get into wholesale just by having a really limited range of items, a range of price points, and work with 3 or 4 or 5 even retailers to test the market, see what works. And you could do this over a period of a year or two to sort of get your feet wet and get into the market. And as you go forward with that, you can start reevaluating it and saying, okay, certain types of items, certain types of price points, and I'm just going to focus on those items and see if I can make it work for me as I go forward. So some other considerations about entering the wholesale market could be items like packaging and labeling, photography, the selling process. Are you going to participate in trade shows? And obviously in Saskatchewan, you've got a great program with Saskatchewan Craft Council in them doing the Toronto gift show. So that's a great way to get introduced to the wholesale market. Payment processes. So you're going to have to look at how are buyers going to pay me and when am I going to get paid? So that's a whole other element. So these are other elements. We've kind of gone way over our time. We started a bit late. But looking at payment processes, how am I going to reach buyers? What is the process involved in doing all of that? So these are other elements and areas that we could investigate. We actually do a whole presentation on wholesale trade shows and booth presentation and how to sell to retailers at the trade show. Here's a picture of the gang from Saskatchewan in their booth in Toronto. So Greg, we've gone over time, so maybe we take a few questions.
Yeah, so I've been just tracking the questions that have come up. So it's 1:45 now, or close to 1:50. So we'll try to answer them as quickly as we can in the next 10 minutes or so, maybe.
Yeah, because we have another session starting soon.
So the first one that came in.
Oh, Greg, it's actually 11:48 our time.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
That's right.
Sorry, folks. We're
I was talking to Bernie. Okay.
We're 2 hours ahead here, and tomorrow we're going to be 3 hours ahead.
Yeah.
So the question that came in earlier in the presentation with regards to just moving into wholesale, and it seems to be more of a general question / comment on you know, deciding to maybe hire somebody to help you out with the business process, as opposed to you having to take all that on in addition to making? Like, do we have any advice on doing that so that the maker can focus on the making? And are, you know, maybe Carmen or Aaron can chime in if there's any programs from the province that support hiring or something like that. But it's a question about that, you know, how do you address that?
Right. So, you know, if I look back when I had my jewelry business, I had actually, I lived in Winnipeg for 10 years, quite a long time ago. I won't say what years it was, but that's where I actually started jewelry when I lived in Winnipeg. And I moved back to Nova Scotia, where I'm from. And the first year I was back in Nova Scotia, I had actually been doing jewelry part-time for about a dozen years, and decided I'm going to buy a house, I'm going to go full-time, set up a studio. I did all of that. And my first full year of production, and I knew that I was already doing some wholesale, and I knew that that's what I wanted to do. But for the first year, I kept a diary of what I did every single day. And at the end of that year, I looked back and said, okay, how much production time, how much time doing other things? And I discovered that 50% of my time was not making jewelry. Literally 50% of my time in the first year of a full-time wholesale business, I was doing other things. I was at a craft market, I was at a wholesale show, I was going to the post office, I was packing stuff, I was labeling things, bookkeeping, all those kinds of elements were part of it. So yeah, I think that the obvious places, if you look at wholesale and a wholesale business, I think the easy places, you know, you can hire students, you can hire family members, you can hire whoever you need to do those packaging and all the processes that are not the direct making, I think are very easy to do. Nowadays, you know, there's so many freelance contractors out there in the marketplace. It's very easy to have a bookkeeper that only comes in one morning every 2 weeks. Whatever you need to sort of satisfy that process as you go forward. I guess the question is, you know, do you have the cash flow to make that work from day one, if that's your intent? So I would say most people start off very slowly with just a few stores. They're doing it all themselves. And then as they grow that, then they start to incorporate other people into the process. We have a couple of people, we're finding that with wholesale, there's thresholds. I find that for most part, most sole proprietor craftspeople can usually get to 50,000 in sales without much extra work, if you really think about how you're producing and how you're doing things. But then after that, we find there's a threshold. Like we have several clients we're working with right now who are between 60 and 100,000 in sales, and they're just doing wholesale. And that's where we found, okay, I don't have enough time to make the stuff. I'm spending all my time shipping and packing and invoicing and all those kinds of elements. So I think it's a matter of looking at what's your production process and how are you going to approach it. And then I would say, try to fill it out with maybe part-time or contract or freelancers to help you with those other pieces.
Yeah, I would just like to add that it, you know, it is a cost and it has to be taken into account, and cash flowing that cost is really important. My big dream is I've always tried to think about building some kind of administrative hub that we can use so people know who to go to, so they don't have to spend a lot of time looking for these people. And I know in our professional practices program with Michael Peterson and Laura Helger, we're really working together to try to come up with ways of getting people to that. But I think the most important element of it is it takes planning. You have to be conscious about, you know, it's conscious decision making about what you're going to incorporate and do. And I think where it gets really stressful, Bernie, is if you're working in multiple kinds of channels. So your revenue streams are really diverse. And so it makes it more difficult to focus and to get that kind of advice about how to move forward.
I would say also, Carmen, I would say you're probably 5 or 6 years ahead of yourself in your idea thinking. But here's the thing, 2020 just happened. And a lot of things changed in 2020. And the biggest thing was technology.
Yes.
I really feel that technology has been moved about 5 years forward in the last 10 months. I really believe that. And now you're starting to see like online accounting systems that if you do an invoicing and receipting and all those kinds of functions, they're starting to become very, very simple to do. It's a matter of finding the right, platform. You think things like Square and like, we switched our website a couple of years ago to Stripe, which is a back end credit card processing system. And that, oh my gosh, the amount of work that cut out of our day. Greg used to have to invoice every single craftsperson for like 100 people for our wholesale show. And then statements and invoicing and receipts and all that kind of stuff. And that all had to be generated and manually done. And now it's all done for us. Our website generates the invoice and Stripe processes all the payments and sends us a spreadsheet. So like so I think what's happening is you're going to see as we go forward in the next year or so, I think you're going to start seeing a lot of those things happening. So I actually think, Carmen, that you're right on. I think you're going to start seeing online solutions that are going to help small businesses and will ultimately help craftspeople with that.
Yeah, and giving the consultation. I think the biggest worry is how do I begin? What's the order I do things in and stuff. And
I would say start with one retailer.
Yeah.
Look in your greater, if you're in Saskatoon or Regina or Calgary, find a store you really love that sells handmade things and go talk to that retailer and say, look, I'm a potter, I'm a jeweler, I'm a weaver. Would you consider placing a wholesale order for my product? That's really your best connection, is just developing that relationship with individual retailers. And then you'll find it'll start to expand from there.
Okay, Greg, maybe we can continue with the questions.
Yeah. On the subject of approaching somebody and having them place that first order, there is a question about can you ask for payment upfront on that first order? How do you do that? And the second part of that question is there a standard form that you should use to get that financial info upfront?
So yes, you can try. I don't know if you'll be successful with it. That is not a standard practice in the industry. In wholesale, generally it's acceptable that retailers will pay first order. Used to be called COD, cash on delivery. Cash on delivery isn't really a process that happens anymore. But what most people do is they will take a credit card and charge the credit card on the day you ship the product. I would say if the order is something extraordinary, custom, specialized in some way, shape, or form, then maybe you could ask for a deposit. But it's not standard practice in the industry, so I would just be aware of that. I am seeing more and more, net 30 days has always been credit terms in the giftware industry, and most retailers will ask or expect that as they go forward with repeat orders. But I'm finding, reading online blogs and other places where we hang out online and talk about wholesale, I'm seeing more and more, especially if it's a smaller scale producer, maybe that is not fully into wholesale in a big way yet, that they're doing credit card on shipping for all their orders. A lot of people are not doing net 30, and I'm sure retailers won't want to hear me say that. But I think that's just becoming a reality of how the economy is evolving in terms of technology and credit card processing. Credit card processing has become relatively, it's a business cost, but it's become relatively inexpensive compared to former processes that you would do a merchant account through your bank. For example, when we switched to Stripe, for example, we had been using a merchant service through our bank. And, we literally, the first year we did that, we saved like $2,000 in a year just by changing providers. So, I think that's an evaluation you're going to have to make. We have some smaller producers that do a lower price point items like soaps and candles. And, a decent order might be $200 or $300. And a lot of people are of the opinion, well, if you can't afford a $200 wholesale order, maybe you shouldn't be buying my product. So I think that's sort of an evaluation you're going to have to make. And but you're going to have a conversation with every retailer about that, because they may have some specific process that they go through with their bookkeeping that just may not make that feasible for them. So I think you're gonna have to look at it on an individualized basis. We actually do have a form for new accounts and new credit that we could share with everybody. We call it a new account form. So basically it's taking the retailer's business information, and it actually has a statement on it where the retailer authorizes you to charge their credit card when you're shipping the goods. It would be good if anytime you're charging somebody's credit card for any purpose that you have their authorization to do that. So yeah, that would be a good thing to have on hand. Anytime you sign up with a new retailer, I was actually started out as a buyer for a gallery, and we had 3 retail stock shops in Winnipeg years ago. And I used to have a credit application form that I used to carry with me to all trade shows, because I got sick and tired of filling out credit applications at trade shows. And basically that's just a 1-page document that outlines who you are: name, address, phone number, who do I contact, who's your bank, who do you do business with, some credit references. When you're starting out with a retailer, I think it's a great idea to get 2 or 3 references and make sure that they're references that are applicable to what you're doing. So other craftspeople, and I guarantee you, if you call a craftsperson and say, oh, I heard, this retailer gave me your name as a reference, I'm sure you'll get an honest opinion as to what they think of that retailer and whether they pay on time and so on.
And we just had a question that came in that was asking for clarification on what net 30 means. So that's an accounting term that if I'm the maker and I'm negotiating with a retailer, I'm giving you 30 days credit, 30 days before I'm going to charge your credit card for the product that I've delivered to you.
Right. And whatever the payment conditions are. So maybe they're going to send you an e-transfer or a check or a credit card. There's many different forms of payment that you can utilize. A lot of craftspeople I'm finding are using e-transfers, because if the bank account is in their personal name, then usually business to business e-transfers are more complicated. But if you're a sole proprietor and the account is in your own personal name, then often people will just do e-transfers. So what you can do is send them an invoice, and then they will send you an e-transfer back. A lot of people right now, I find, if they're using Squarespace or PayPal, they will send their retailer an online invoice, and all they have to do is click and pay it direct online. There's no other process. And then you're not collecting people's confidential credit card information. It's all done, externally on a platform somewhere. So yeah, so 30 days is giving credit. There's also net 60, net 90 in some circumstances. So, and it's usually just a courtesy that you're offering to retailers when they reorder your product.
Right. So there's some trust there that they're going to pay up when the time comes after that 30 days or 60 days passes. We've got 4 or 5 more questions, so we'll try to get through them. One of these questions is, how do you calculate monthly fixed costs into your unit price? So when you're talking about your pricing, when you're never sure how many units you're going to sell in a month. And would it make sense to say that projecting based on previous sales is going to allow you to do that in at least an estimated kind of way?
Yeah, I think that in terms of those fixed costs, I would say you would use some form of averaging.
Mhm.
figure it out. And I also think you also need to look at, when you get into the wholesale market, if you're going to do more than one or two stores, I think it's important that you know what your production capacity is, so that you're not overreaching in terms of promising retailers that you're going to deliver. In all my years of doing this, and my 35 years have been strictly in the craft industry, the number one, some days I think this is 2021, and what's going on, but the number one complaint we hear from retailers is taking an order and not delivering. So not only do you ruin your own reputation, but you ruin the reputation of the whole craft industry by not delivering. So I tell people, when you go into wholesale, know how long it takes you to produce something. If you're a potter and it takes 3 weeks to get $1,000 order out the door, then don't take $5,000 worth of order for delivery in a month. It sort of stands to reason. So you need to figure out what is your production capacity. And then I would say take those fixed costs and average those against what you can produce in a reasonable period of time, whether that's 2 weeks or 4 weeks or 6 weeks, whatever it is in terms of your process.
Okay, can we give any recommendations on management programs or software, I think, for tracking your inventory and for making these decisions that we're talking about?
Oh boy, inventory is a nightmare. Oh, do you know what? I don't have the definitive one. And the reason I say that, a lot of people attempt to use whatever accounting system they're using, so they know what's going in and out, and then they can allocate that through their accounting system.
But this question is a little different than that, because this one is involving, the question is actually about how you track raw materials to move them from raw materials into inventory and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah.
So it's even more complicated than it really can't be handled by an accounting system.
No, you're right. And that was the point I was going to get to. No, I haven't seen, because you know what? I haven't seen that many craftspeople that have gone to that extent of doing that work in terms of figuring that out. I haven't. I think there definitely is out there in terms of the manufacturing sector, but whether that can be adapted, like I know some of the lean manufacturing processes do have computer programs that go with them, but we haven't looked to see whether that can be adapted to a smaller scale production or not. But that's a very good question that we can look into and see if that's possible. But inventory management on all levels is really difficult. And we haven't seen, we've worked with a couple of people locally who have been trying to manage consignment with high-end galleries, and like what goes out, what comes back, what's the differentiation and everything. And even that's been a really, really difficult process to try to get a handle on. But I think we'll look into that though, Carmen, and see.
Maybe there's an opportunity.
Yeah, there are several. Well, you know what? We've worked with several lean manufacturing consultants over the years, and it's fascinating. It's actually a fascinating process to hear what they think about, because most of them are engineers who are looking at. They're not looking at, yeah, you're making pottery or jewelry. They're looking at steps and processes all along the way, and that can lead to really surprising things. We about 6 or 7 years ago, we had a half a dozen craftspeople that were very production oriented people, and they actually went through a lean manufacturing process, and it was fascinating. Like several people were able to increase their capacity by 40% just by how they did things. Like you get used to doing things in a certain way in your studio, and to have an engineer come in and watch you for a whole week and say, you know what? I think you need to reorganize your workspace because you're not efficient in what you're doing. And I think that can lead to some real surprises, but we can reach out to a few of those and see if there actually is something on the market that would do that for you.
That'd be great. Thanks. I think we only have time for one more question, Greg, because it's all
Yep.
got
We're gonna-
45 minutes before the
Sure. Okay, so Carmen, did you want us maybe to address that question of consignment then? Somebody did ask that.
Oh, did they? Oh,
Yeah, somebody
sure.
was
Go
asking
ahead.
about in terms of, if your goal is to wholesale, should you even bother with consignments? I guess is the gist of the question, if somebody's asking you to.
Do you want the real answer or what I really think? I'm sorry, I'm just being facetious there, but honestly, consignment does not work with wholesale. It really, really doesn't. And a lot of people who are doing consignment kind of think they're doing wholesale. Consignment is really a payment process. It's I'm delivering the goods and you're going to pay me on a consigning basis when the item sells. That really does not jive with the concept of wholesale. Wholesale is I get an order, I fill the order, I get paid for the order. When you send product out on consignment, you may never sell that. It may sit there for years on end, and you've already invested time, labor, raw materials in that process. So if you're someone who's thinking about getting into wholesale and doing wholesale on a continuing basis, we most frequently see that, yeah, we know consignment exists. We know it's a reality out there. There are some, craft councils, even some museums and nonprofit organizations that do a great job of representing their people on a consignment basis. But I would say we see most frequently that once people get into wholesale as being, 50 or 60% of their business, then in most cases they drop consignment completely because they just can't manage it. You've got tons of inventory out there in different shops sitting, doing nothing, and you're not getting compensated for it right away. I think there are places for consignment. I think if it's local, and I think you can monitor that the work is being displayed properly and that you're getting paid on a regular basis, you should have a consignment agreement in place in writing. If that business goes bankrupt, you could lose everything. If you don't have an agreement in place that the product remains the property of the artist until sold, you could lose that product. So that becomes an issue. The other big issue is replacement cost. Product gets shop worn regularly. If you're doing textiles and your stuff's been sitting for a year in a shop, what does it look like at the end of that year? Who fixes that? Do you get compensated for stuff that gets shop worn or broken or damaged while it's in the possession of that retailer? Those become really, really important elements. We are going to be launching on Wednesday. We're going to be launching our export portal with Ryerson University. And Greg, do you have the link for that, Greg? We could put it in the chat.
Oh yeah, sure.
People could,
yeah.
That's next Wednesday afternoon. We've signed a memorandum of agreement with Ryerson University. They have an export platform, and we're going to be putting all our wholesale and export documentation online on their platform. Greg has already started loading up some of the files. We do have sample consignment agreements and tip sheets on if you're going to enter into a consignment agreement, what you need to think of. We also have one on exclusivity as well that we can share with everyone.
Greg and Bernie, can you make sure that we'll send out answers to the remaining questions that haven't been answered?
Sure,
so we can download them and send them. But we really, I think, need to move on.
Sure, great.
So that we can have a break before the next session.
Sure.
I want to thank you very much. It was a great, informative, very dense presentation. And, we're here to help you move forward. If anyone's interested in moving forward in the wholesale program, contact, if you're an SCC member, contact Alexa. we'll start the discussions with you because we do have a good program.
Yeah, we've had great success with the wholesale show in Toronto. We actually picked up on that from Carmen. And I'll be talking about that in our trend session tomorrow.
Yeah, it's one of the great things of belonging to the Canadian Crafts Federation nationally is that we get to work with fantastic organizations across the country. And what we're trying to do more and more is to take advantage of different skill sets that exist across the country. And so that's why Bernie and Greg are here with us this weekend to help us grow our own expertise and so that we don't have to do all the basic research ourselves. So